Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. The news from Syria just over a month ago came as a surprise to many. Reports first came that rebel forces had taken Aleppo with minimal fighting and then travelled south with one major city falling after another until they reached the capital, Damascus, and President Bashar al-Assad fled. After 5 decades of authoritarian rule by the Assad regime and almost 14 years of bloody war waged so that they retained power, they were suddenly gone. The country has been transformed in the meantime, but there are many challenges left ahead, not least to rebuild the lives and homes of a population who has witnessed mass displacement and trauma. With me on the podcast today are 2 scholars who have been immersed in studying the lives of Syrians during this conflict. Wendy Pearlman, Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, has researched the lives of those forced to leave their homes. Her last book, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria, is based on interviews with over 300 displaced Syrians in countries spanning the Middle East, Europe and America. The result is a valuable documentation of the conflict as experienced by a wide range of people. Her latest book, just out, is The Home I Work to Make, Voices from the Syrian Diaspora, which similarly uses the words of her interviewees to show how people rebuild lives and homes when theirs is lost to violence. Ammar Azzouz, Research Fellow at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, has also been preoccupied with the destruction of home and homes in Syria. Born and brought up in Homs, he left in 2011 for graduate study and watched the destruction of his home city from afar, unable to return, which did not stop him studying and writing about the effects of war on Homs and the rest of Syria. The resulting book was Domicide, Architecture, War and the Destruction of Home in Syria, taking a concept of how home, in all its scales and variety, is another victim of war, experienced by all, whether their physical houses have been destroyed or not. Wendy, Ammar, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Wendy, you've noted how every human being has some kind of concept of home. Has this been reflected in the engagement you've seen with your book?
Yes, it has. One of the things that drew me to the idea of home is that it is something that touches every human life. I mean, there are not necessarily all that many concepts that you can ask literally anyone, and the question should resonate in some way. And I think the question of what is home to you or where is home is something that every human being can relate to. Whether people's answer to that question is negative or positive or easy or complicated, it's part of being a human being is to have some idea of home. And that's part of what drew me to write a book of Syrian stories with a focus on home, was a way to reach out to non-Syrians and bring them in to listen to the Syrian experience, to empathize with it, to try to connect with it in some way. And as people read the book or engage with the book, I hope that they're doing exactly that, asking themselves, how would I cope in such a situation? And not just thinking of Syrians as I think many in Europe and North America do in the Syrian experience, think of it as something quite foreign, quite different of, oh, these poor people who suffered so much, but I can't imagine what it's like to be them. But instead to approach Syrians as thought partners, as neighbors, as friends in thinking through this universal human concern and in thinking with Syrians about the idea of home, emphasizing what all humans share as opposed to what makes those who've suffered tremendously in terms of authoritarianism, war, forced displacement.
You also make the very valuable point that although this might be a universal issue of building a home, actually refugees have a unique perspective on what it is and how we build it. Can you unpack this a little?
Yeah, the idea there is that some who have never been forced to leave their homes might take home for granted. And here I quote the cultural geographer Yves Tuan, who says to be completely at home is to be unreflectively secure in a given location. That to be completely at home is to not really have to think about home that much. And those who've been forced from home don't have the luxury of not thinking about home. And there are often these reflections of thinking, not only am I at home or am I not at home, but what do I need even to feel at home? What is it that I want from a home? What is it that I can do without if I'm forced and have no choice but to do without it? Leads to deep, deep reflections, and I think a deep, deep wisdom that those who've migrated, and especially those who've been forced to flee, have. And this is a wisdom from which all people in all situations can learn, should respect, should appreciate. And that's part of what I think displaced Syrians have to give the world as people think through what home means to them, whatever situation they're in.
Well, Ammar, you've included a lot of voices of Syrians in your book, but you've also written about how you've had pushback from academic colleagues in your decision to incorporate the more personal anecdotes and the emotions into your writing. Was the intention in doing that similar to Wendy? You're trying to create more empathy in the reader?
Similar to Wendy, I really wanted to humanize and individualize the suffering of millions of people. So since 2011, more than 12 or 13 million people have been displaced from their homes inside and outside the country in places such as Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, UK, Germany, and beyond. And at that time, since the revolution started in March 2011, people have been turned into numbers and statistics. And very often when we're hearing about the academic discourses and also the news media reporting on Syria, we hear about the numbers of buildings being destroyed, about the people who left, but in somehow they become abstract, without faces, without stories, without colors, without interest, without dreams. And in somehow I wanted to resist this idea of turning people into masses and into numbers by including the individual stories of what it means to be displaced. How do people try to build new homes for them? And what it means to lose home, because we live in a time where we have a sea of images and a flood of footages of destruction everywhere, from Ukraine and Sudan to Iraq and Palestine, and of course in Syria. And in somehow we continue our lives, but in every image of destruction, it's about the livelihoods and the lives and the stories of these people who have survived these massacres and these horrors of wars, but also it's about the stories of those who left.
And I realise, and I take your point that we shouldn't be focusing on numbers, but just so that listeners have an idea of the scale of all of this, you mentioned 12 to 13 million displaced. Now, that is well over half of the 2011 population. Am I right? And I think, Ammar, you quoted one piece of research that said a full quarter of all domestic spaces in Syria pre-2011 have been destroyed now. So I do think it's important to have the numbers as well. Is there anything to add to that about the scale of all of this?
You are absolutely right, Lydia, and I think it's important to highlight the facts as a starter for people who are not familiar with the situation. For instance, in my city, Homs, the third largest city in Syria, more than half of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed, and around a quarter of the neighborhoods have been partially destroyed. So in somehow the city has turned into islands of destruction in between neighborhoods that's still standing. And I think for us as observers, as people even from the country, it's important to know these facts. But we need to add additional layer beyond the numbers of what it means to lose one's own home.
I mean, it's It's just almost unimaginable, isn't it, that scale of destruction? I mean, Wendy, you've interviewed many hundreds of people who have experienced it. Do you ever get used to these sorts of numbers? Or does it just hit you again and again?
Yeah, I think it hits on several scales. And Ammar's wonderful book talks about how home is at different scales, that there's the scale of destruction, which is unfathomable, these sheer numbers of material destruction, of people forced to leave, of people killed, of people disappeared, of people in prison, of injuries. It's unfathomable. And then there's the scale of the individual, intensely human individual experience about, as Ammar was saying, what all these numbers mean for an individual life, for people's dreams and whether they were able to fulfill those dreams or they were cut short, for people's loves and families, whether loved ones have been lost or loved ones have been separated, scattered across continents. In the most intimate details of a human life, we see what all of these numbers mean for people who are searching for meaning, for dignity, for freedom, and often that has been taken away in the cruelest of ways, and yet still people work and sacrifice and don't give up to find whatever dignity, freedom, authenticity they can wherever they are in the world. So it's both the degree of grief and mourning and violence is unfathomable, but every step of the way is also how we can be inspired by people's refusal to give up and the strength that they muster, physical strength, emotional strength, to keep going and keep trying to build lives that are fulfilling.
Well, we'll come back to rebuilding in a minute, but Ammar, I just wanted to ask you first about the title of your book. Now, Google certainly doesn't like the word domicide. As I've been writing it, it just endlessly corrected it to domicile, which is quite a telling change. So it's certainly not in the AI library yet, but I know you're not the first to use it. So can you tell me why you chose it as the title of your book and what does it mean to you?
In summary, the word domicide means the deliberate killing of home. And I wanted to use it because in many wars that we see in our lives, we hear about buildings being part of the collateral damage of wars and occupations and dictatorship. But if we unpack what's happening in many geographies, we see that there's a systematic approach towards destroying people's home. And that destruction is used as a weapon of war and a weapon to collectively punish people who do not agree or who are not on the side of those who are ruling these countries. We have seen that in Gaza, we see that in Syria, of course, in many cities, and we have seen that in many other parts of the world. And I wanted to use this concept of domicide in a way that we centralize home. Very often when we hear about destruction, and especially in the scholarly work in architecture and urban studies, we hear so much about the destruction of the ancient sites, the cultural heritage sites that they are extremely significant, of course, such as Palmyra. But we focus less on the mundane, on the bedrooms, on the living rooms, the kitchen, the livelihoods of the people, where their childhood is, where the memory is. And that's why I wanted to shift the conversation from the ancient heritage into the intimate home. And domus is the word home in Latin, and side is the killing. So it's similar to genocide or suicide. It's the deliberate killing of home.
And that is obviously, certainly the way you've written about it, exists in a huge variety of scales, right? Kind of on a spectrum. Because, as Wendy, you've written so compellingly about, home exists on so many scales, sort of on a spectrum. Can you give an indication of the kind of meanings of home that emerge during your interviews?
Yeah, well, I think what's so fascinating about the idea of home, it's such an incredibly rich concept because it exists on many scales, from the intimate to the national and the international, and it's also so multidimensional. So what I explore in this book of stories and Syrian testimonials is that for some, home is a place, and they might relate to that place as their hometown, as their nation, as their own house or room or some physical, material, geographical, locatable space, but home is also a feeling. And then what kind of feeling is it? It can be a feeling of security, a feeling of love. Many of us know this expression, home is where the heart is, which suggests that home is not any particular place. It's wherever those who you love are. And maybe with your loved ones, any place, even a foreign place, can be a home. Although for some, no, that's not the case. There's one story in the book in which a man talks about how he has his loved ones in one place outside Syria, but for him, his home will always be his hometown in Syria, where he came from, not this new place where he lives and has found new loves with a partner and a child. Home is also about authenticity. To be at home is to feel like you can relax and be yourself and not have to put on appearances. You can be your truest self. So there's a sense of authenticity and the security, not just physical safety, but the emotional security of being who you are without having to perhaps pretend to be something else. There's also, I think, home as a sense of a possibility, that home is about a place where you can dream, can have aspirations, can imagine a future. So there's all of these dimensions, and the book shows displaced Syrians now scattered across the world trying to search for these different dimensions, and in the course of it, find for themselves what they need most out of a home. Is it a place? Is it feelings and relationships? Is it political freedom to be able to express themselves? Is it how people find what they need to matter in the world and to make lives worth living, as Bell Hooks says about home?
Well, there are so many moving stories in your book that record all of these aspects. And coming to the political, your last statement, one really struck me. She said that she found home in the revolution, that's where she felt at home because she could express herself. And I thought that was very beautiful. And I did wonder, actually, if Syrians are beginning to feel that sense of home now. Are you sensing that at all, either of you?
I think that's absolutely right. And it was one of the quotes that really shook me, that the revolution is my homeland. That's how the person said. But I remember what Khalid Khalifa wrote and said once, who was the author of Death is Hard Work.
A very famous Syrian novelist, written a lot of landmark novels.
Yes, absolutely. And before he passed away, he was interviewed once in Damascus, and he said, I feel exiled here. And this sense of being exiled in Syria has been for long the case for many Syrians before the revolution started and throughout the years of revolution, because they felt that this place is not for them. They felt that they have no voice, they have no agency. And now suddenly, after the 8th of December, they do feel that they can reclaim this voice and agency and this home. But what I also want to say about Wendy's book, there's a quote that I really loved. I mean, I highlighted millions of pieces in the book, but one of them, a person says that, I quote, I used to dream of being pretty and successful, but that's not my world anymore. My home is no longer on land. My home is my God. My home is in the sky. Sometimes I look at the stars that I used to watch in Syria. They are the same here after all. And I really love this. I mean, there's a huge sense of homelessness in the Syrian diaspora and inside the country. But I think like now, maybe it's time to rethink what home means after the collapse of the dictatorship.
One thing I found fascinating, and Ammar, I'd be interested to how you're thinking about home reflects this as well, is that home is this dynamic concept, that it might always be changing. And when I was doing interviews with Syrian refugees, people might at one point in a time think home is one thing, and then 1 or 2 or 3 years later think something else. And I think all of the stories I gathered were clearly before the collapse of the Assad regime. And if I were to go back to each of these people now and say, what is home now? Their thinking has changed and their feeling has changed. Maybe fundamentally, maybe not. But the interviews I did for this past book were at a time when many thought that they would never be able to return home. And they were faced with this incredible challenge of rethinking and creating some home when their home in Syria was no longer accessible to them. And they were facing a reality that many thinking that they would never go back. And what can home possibly mean when your original home was lost? Or as Ammar was saying, maybe never fully existed in its full sense, because in its political sense it didn't. It was Assad's Syria, not Syrian Syria. So whether it never fully existed in all of its potential, or it was a place that had become off limits due to dictatorship and war, what then does home mean? And now there is an opening of possibly going back, or for many having already gone back. And that has to change what home can mean, but also not completely, because many people have worked incredibly hard to build new homes in exile. They have learned new languages, retrained themselves in different jobs, built new communities, pushed themselves in ways they may never have thought that they could, to create something like home, or as close as it could be, in places around the world where they before maybe never even imagined visiting. And now are faced with new questions of, okay, after all I've done to create this new home, should I go back to Syria and create home there? Will I stay home here? Can I create maybe a life in both places? Well, of course, the situation in Syria is quite still unknown and uncertain. So these, I think, are new questions that people are asking themselves, that 6 weeks ago, people may perhaps never even imagined having to ask themselves. Now, so many questions are thrown into the air, and home is one of them.
We'll definitely come to return, reconstruction and rebuilding. But just to pick up on something you said there, and I want to take it back to Ammar. Now, it was hard to imagine for many that they could ever return. And I very much got the sense, Ammar, reading your book, that you really were reading it with the assumption that Assad was there to stay. That when you talked about reconstruction, it was in the constraints and the political system of Assad, giving out land as political reward, and it was those sorts of things. Am I right in that sense, that you really wrote it as if that it was Assad's Syria?
I think there was a huge sense of despair in the last at least 5-6 years, because when the revolution started, everyone thought that it would be a matter of few weeks or months that things would change, following what happened in Tunis or in Egypt, for instance. But then after a decade of war and fatigue and violence, there was a huge sense of depression, and Syria has turned from the news headlines into a footnote in the history and in news media. So I was, as Wendy said, many Syrians were training themselves to accept that exile is a fixed reality, let's say, and that exile is forever. And when I was writing, I was also thinking of Spain and Franco, and what if the reconstruction happened at the time of the dictatorship, So for me, it was taking things by reality, that what if this dictatorship would only collapse with the end life of Assad before anything happened. So it really was at the moment where there was a huge sense of despair within the Syrian community and also the global interest in Syria.
Well, you do talk about slow domicide and slow violence. So you contrast the outright shelling and bombing and that kind of destruction from war with Assad's approach to urban planning, which equally has at its core dispossession and not listening to the vulnerable, not consulting the vulnerable, and really punishing them in the service of creating Syria in his own image, right? And you write about reconstruction. From that moment of despair, we now know, you write about it that reconstruction can do as much damage as war. Now, that's kind of hard to read when we've seen such images of the bombing and the shelling. What did you mean by that?
I mean, in history, at time of dictatorship, but also in time of places where there are good intentions, reconstruction could be seen as sites of hope and optimism and the start of a new future. They could also cause harm and damage and dispossession and displacement. In Beirut, after the end of the civil war in 1990, in Coventry, after the Second World War in the 40s, in these both cities, the reconstruction of the city center caused more damage and destruction than the time of the war itself. because the intention was to start again, to build a new city, to forget the past, to move on. But in that process, there was a lot of destruction and erasure of memory that only years and decades later, people started feeling like nostalgic to what remained of their history, to what was already existing. Now, in the case of dictatorship, such as what I was writing about in Assad, Syria, he used the reconstruction as a weapon as well. So he started issuing new urban plans and laws to say that these neighborhoods are quote unquote informal and completely razing them to the ground. And they were mainly for people who opposed the government and who were sympathizers with the revolution. So he wanted to use the reconstruction with, of course, with his Russian allies as a way to gain interest from Western communities, to gain reconstruction funds, but also to marginalize the people who have lost so much and to punish them in the name of reconstruction.
Well, and one of those marginalisations, one of the effects of marginalising the most vulnerable already, and I think both of you touched on this, but it was a shocking realisation to me that so many of the displaced within Syria, so-called IDPs, internally displaced persons, they were displaced to somewhere extremely close to their original home, sometimes just in a different neighbourhood in the same city, but unable to visit either because of new realities on the ground, roadblocks and sectarian lines and all those divisions that have emerged, or because it had been destroyed, but they were being forced to live in the same neighbourhood. Now, that's a very different experience, isn't it, to being exiled in a foreign culture many miles away, but no less traumatic. Can you speak to the difference in the experiences of exile? Wendy, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I did interviews with people in different parts of the world, and I think people's experiences in searching for home and their experiences of exile is shaped by who they are and their stage of life, whether people are older or younger, their various aspects of their personal background, and of course by the characteristics of where they wind up. And where people wind up can be this product of luck, resources, chance. Many of the people I talked to fled Syria because they needed to, because they were facing arrest, because bombs were falling. They knew they needed to get out and got out. But what happened to their lives afterwards could be the product of all sorts of circumstances they could never foresee. There's people who get off on a train and now are German as opposed to Dutch because they got off on one stop rather than another because a security guard got on the train and they had to get off. Or people go further if they have more money and resources to buy fake passports or whatever, or people who went on boats or not went on boats. So the experience of exile, I think, is very diverse. Of course, we know that the large majority of Syrians who are forced to flee Syria remain in countries on Syria's borders, with the largest number in Turkey and then in Lebanon and in Jordan, where there might be more cultural proximity, perhaps the same language, religious similarities, landscapes, foods, and so forth. But these are countries that do not offer even the minimum of rights, where people often have temporary protection, but not rights to legal permanency, working in the informal economic markets without dignified housing and opportunities for their children, and fundamentally unstable. That's one experience of exile that the majority of refugees are experiencing. There are those who make it further afield to Europe, to the Americas, where there are often more opportunities for asylum and even citizenship status. So there's more opportunities for some sort of a legal permanence, but cope with cruel bureaucracies, new languages, new systems. And maybe the one commonality is racism and anti-refugee sentiment, no matter where people are, whether they're near or far. But all of these are very different circumstances of those exiled outside the country who are coping not only with the loss of home, coping not only with the mourning and the grief of what has been lost and what they've experienced in war and under dictatorship, but also coping with all of the challenges posed to them by the new country where they've wound up, which can be, from economic to legal to social to linguistic to cultural and beyond.
Ammar, do you think there's a specific form of trauma resulting from the domicide when you're forced to live alongside the results of the destruction?
I mean, I interviewed people similar to Wendy, including residents inside homes, and they say that these images are everyday images they see in their lives. Sometimes people who were survivors of destruction of their homes, they also had to sell their rights to their homes. I do remember one person told me we couldn't afford, it's impossible to afford like rebuilding our own home because it is inside like a building that was heavily destroyed. So they sold their rights there. And he said, I still go every day to look at the building because they are like tenants there. And of course, like I wanted to say that sometimes people were almost like living in a city that turned into a big prison because Homs was divided multiple times and multiple neighborhoods have been under full siege. So people were living like in a proximity of, I don't know, like a few kilometers inside their own neighborhoods. But even when they are not under siege, few of the men that I know and I spoke to, they told me we didn't leave the neighborhood for many years because we were afraid of being taken into fighting. So in somehow, sometimes people were displaced, but they are stuck in one neighborhood because they are afraid. And sometimes people have lost home, but they still see these traumatic memories in front of them. They are unable to do anything about it. And maybe they had to be pushed to selling it, as the case of many, many Syrians.
And keeping on the theme of neighbourhood, because of course that is a large part of all of our homes, is the streets we walk every day, the shops we go to every day. There's a way that politics really intrudes on this level, and we see it in ideological places all over the world, that they change the street names when they are retaking places or a new regime comes in. We see it with communism. Karl Marx is used all over communist places. Or Said Qutb made an appearance in Egypt when Morsi was in power. So I want to know what you think might lie ahead in Syria. What will we see in terms of how places are going to be named now? Ammar, do you have an idea?
In Wendy's wonderful book, there's a guy called Hani who says, and I quote, "If you had offered my dad a pot of gold to move from Deir ez-Zor to Damascus, he would have refused because Deir ez-Zor was the home and his whole life." So people have a huge love to their places. Maybe it's difficult for foreigners or outsiders to understand, like, it looks like an ordinary neighborhood. But for people who grow up in these streets, they go to the same bakery shops, the same neighbors. These intimate memories are so valuable. And I think the future is, of course, uncertain, but if we are thinking about the future reconstruction, it should be built on the memory of the people rather than on disorienting them again and again through the process of reconstruction. So we have to think about what was there before, who were the people, trying to locate people to the neighborhoods that they were in before the war, before they lost their home, and trying to create a city that looks like their own city rather than importing a model from Dubai. There's a concept called Dubaization, which is like taking all these skyscrapers and imagining that this is the right future. But we have to think about the identity, the sense of belonging in Syria, and build a future that looks like the people.
Well, you've mentioned memorialisation there, and and previously you mentioned Beirut as a bit of a warning about how to rebuild a city after conflict. And they notoriously haven't really considered memorialisation, seeing it as potentially too divisive or too difficult to tackle head on, to tackle the sectarian lines within the country. So what role do you think memorialisation of the conflict, not just going back to pre-war Syria, as you're mentioning, Ammar, but what do you think needs to happen in terms of honouring the memories and the victims of what has gone on over the past 14 years?
I interviewed once Dr. Dathia Fioch-Rose at the University of Cambridge, who wrote a book called Reconstructing Spain. And she told me we cannot sweep the remains of the war and the story of the war below the rug and pretend that nothing has happened. And I think very often in the aftermath of war, people want to move on and try to find like a process of reconciliation. And in that process, they might erase what happened. But what would be powerful is to face the history and to face what happened and try to create a dialogue spatially about what it means to think about the places of massacre or protest or arrest inside Syria? What is the future of prisons like Sydnaya that became a place for trend and likes and, all these TikTokers and like celebrity people going there? And even I saw a very horrible video today of like a young group of Syrians going and painting the cells and removing all the memory of what happened. This is rewriting history. I think we really need experts to be thinking about the future of these sites of torture and violence in a way that we face what happened. And of course, looking at history, we see many places like Berlin trying to face what happened in their sites, but also in Coventry to think again. Some of the churches where, like the Coventry Cathedral, was in ruins and kept frozen in time as a sort of reconciliation and remembering. But I think in the process of moving forward, we shouldn't neglect what happened, and we should write the city through text, but also through the buildings.
Yeah, it's such a huge question. And I think that just as the designing of the new political system for Syria should be a process that's deliberative and inclusive, that brings many voices together to determine what this new political system should look like. Similarly, there should be a deliberative, inclusive process to think about memorialization, about truth, about reconciliation. I mean, the question of truth and memory is also related to accountability and justice, which we know are enormous themes for the new and free Syria. But questions from whether there should be museums and what sorts of museums should tell the story of what Assad rule was and tell the story of the revolution and the war, to monuments that might be all over many different towns and villages and cities marking things that happened, to school curriculum. What will future generations of Syrian children be taught in school about the entire history of the country, including the revolution and war? That there's a role for arts and popular culture, whether we're going to see movies and television shows or other forms of art and memorialization, that will all construct a narrative. And of course, that narrative will also be changing, and there's not going to be, I think, one exclusive story, because there's not one exclusive experience. That's something that is flexible and dynamic and diverse, to give voice to what different people's experiences were and allow people to voice. Will there be the role of national archives? Will there be enormous projects of oral history, of storytelling, to memorialize, to remember, to honor, and also to learn from the past and have this memory become a part of the new free Syria that hopefully will provide people with rights and protection so that the crimes of the past will never recur?
But some of those, it sounds like, has to happen quite quickly. Some will take a while. But, Berlin took decades to come up with its various ways of memorializing. But Ammar, you're saying that people were painting today, which means that there needs to be some sort of plan right now. Are you aware of anything that is planning for the immediate future of not reconstruction, but protection, I suppose?
I think there are networks of human rights inside Syria, and they should be active in this. And I saw one of these networks directors saying that only experts and only with permission people should be entering these sites at the moment, because there has been looting, there has been destruction of documentations, there had been a mess. If you see some of the images, there's a huge loss. These are all about archives of the people who disappeared and archives of the people who were killed or tortured. And there'd be more active networks on protecting the story and what happened there.
Now, social media has been flooded with so many images of joy since the fall of Assad. But of course, social media is a very self-selecting group of people. And that I know that there are a lot of emotions around this moment, not least the fear, the anxiety of the complete unknown that's ahead. Wendy, you're in touch with so many Syrians around the world. What are the feelings and the fears that you have been hearing since the fall of Assad?
What I heard most from people is, several things. One is that the feelings are indescribable. and that there are this mix of emotions, a roller coaster, a cocktail of emotions. Disbelief. Many people I talked to still for several days after December 8th were still almost pinching themselves. Is it real? Is it real? Will I wake up and realize it was a dream? People talked about having dreams and wondering, what's reality and will it turn out not to be true? That was one sense of one kind of emotion that came out. But for sure, joy, relief, exhilaration, but also a tremendous amount of pain and sadness. And everyone has lost people and people who've been disappeared. So, of course, with the fall of the Assad regime and the going up of the revolutionary flag, immediately came these liberation of prisons and people coming out of prisons, and everyone who's waiting for someone who's been disappeared, waiting and hoping that their loved one might come out. And then, as we know, as the days went by, people still waiting and maybe facing a reality of that maybe their loved ones didn't make it. If someone was killed, how were they killed, when, what, and by whom? So that's still an ongoing process of waiting for information and truth and working for it and demanding it. But my sense, watching this from afar, is that for so many, it's almost the joy of seeing this unbelievable moment actual happening of liberation from the Assad regime comes paired with the sadness for the people who did not make it, who also sacrificed and so much, but were not. Everyone can think of somebody that they wish were there with them to experience this moment. So the joy you feel in experiencing it is coupled with the grief and the pain of someone you wish were here with you and who is not. And the pain and the joy almost as twins that cannot be separated. In addition to fear and uncertainty and apprehension about what comes next and all the unpredictability, but these seem to be among the two dominant feelings on the human level of what the moment meant of liberation.
Ammar, sounds familiar?
Very much so. And I just want to say, like, a comment I saw from one of my friends, Sanakikhia, her name. She was in Homs and in Syria recently, and she wrote online that there are many reasons to fear the future, but there are millions of reasons to be hopeful about the future. And then somehow I found that quote very powerful, because even in the great book of Wendy, there's a person who's asked, like, were you afraid from the boat when you took a boat to cross countries? And he said, come on, like, after living all this nightmare in Syria, prisons, torture, fear, do I fear a boat? So and somehow it seems like we're just arriving to a new shore, a new start, and we know at least that there's a road to look at. It's going to be long, the struggle will be long, there are many struggles, but we've been under dictatorship for over half a century, and now we're just witnessing a new start. What I found really emotional, I mean, every person posting a photo of themselves inside the country, hugging their father, kissing their mom, being in their home again. I just want to tell them thank you, and I'm happy, I feel you, I feel as if it's my happiness. But I find it even more powerful for people going to Syria for the first time in their life. Because after the massacre in Hama in the 1980s, many Syrians have been exiled, and they were never able to speak loudly about it because they fear about their families who remain in Syria. And I saw people like Razan Safour or Ubaida Ghadban putting this first time in Syria, and I just feel, my God, what would it be to be in one's own country for the first time? And they are, I think, I don't know them personally, but maybe in their late 20s or a little bit older, I don't know. But it was just beautiful. But to echo what Wendy was saying, it's also a time of pain, grief, and glory. So all these different emotions. I know from one of my family's relatives, she was saying that her son hasn't returned. And this has been the trauma being relived as if the trauma is alive again, because now it's a confirmation that maybe there is no coming home for the missing loved ones. So it's a mix of joy and pain and grief, and it still feels so surreal even after a month from the collapse of the Assad.
Well, we started this podcast talking about how you've made your books personal to your readers and humanised this immense war and conflict. And I wonder if I could go back to what this idea means to you personally after all your work on the topic. Wendy, what have you learnt about your relationship to home? Ammar, has the writing of your book helped maintain a connection to your home?
Yeah, many things. As I was saying earlier, how home is a multi-dimensional concept. And I think it's inspired me to think about home more broadly, that often we ask, where is home to you? And the stories I heard inspired me to think more about what is home, that it can be for many fundamentally a place, but it's not only a place. And that changing home from a where to a what was something that I've taken away in thinking about my own relationship to home. But it is so inspiring now. Syria can be a home for people, and people can go back and find freedom and dignity there, that I don't want to underestimate the degree that home really is aware. And we're seeing that to the degree that people, even if they built home in different ways, the where of Syria is irreplaceable, and so incredibly inspiring to think that people can build whatever home is to them, they can build it in that specific place again.
For me, I wanted to quote Adorno, who said, "For a man who has no homeland, writing is a homeland." And for me, in the 14 years of exile and forced displacement, being uprooted has been very painful. But in somehow I found a calling in writing, and for me, just being on a blank page and face the paper and write the emotions that I struggled to tell myself, that I struggled to tell my parents how I feel, that I struggled to tell my friends how I feel. Writing offered a home that was priceless, and it was the most important thing beyond any other thing for me. Like many Syrians, we feel disoriented and exiled, but writing was, for me personally, a place to return to. But also, home is the people around, and I've been surrounded by great, kind people here in Britain, where I currently live, and they made exile way more livable and less painful. And it reminds me of also the kindness and generosity also of Syrians who remained, close to each other in diaspora and inside the country, which shows us how beauty emerged even at a time of chaos, and how solidarity and kindness remain even at the harshest times of our human lives.
Well, I very much look forward to both your work in the future, as I'm sure you'll carry on documenting and exploring what home is in Syria during this long road ahead, but hopefully a positive road. Thank you so much, both of you, Wendy Pearlman, Ammar Azzouz, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. Ammar's book, Domicide, Architecture, War and the Destruction of Home in Syria, and Wendy's book, The Home I Work to Make, Voices from the Syrian Diaspora, are both available now, online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.